The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road when Michael Rivera noticed the temperature gauge on his luxury sedan climbing into the red zone. Wisps of steam began escaping from under the hood as he guided the overheating vehicle onto the gravel shoulder. Through his windshield, the vast expanse of Cedar Creek Valley spread before him, its patchwork of farmland bordered by distant mountains. His GPS showed nothing but scattered farms for miles around, and his phone's signal had disappeared 15 minutes ago. As the engine ticked and cooled in the late June heat, Mike loosened his tie and stepped out onto the empty road. The air smelled of sun-baked earth and the distant scent of irrigation. According to his navigation system, the small town of Millfield was still 12 miles ahead, too far to walk in his Italian leather shoes and business attire. Mike popped the hood and was immediately enveloped in a cloud of steam that made him step back, coughing. 4 years as CEO of RiverTech Solutions had prepared him for boardroom negotiations and investor pitches, but nothing in his Stanford MBA had covered roadside emergencies in farm country. In the distance, he noticed a weathered wooden mailbox. At the end of a long dirt driveway, Willow Creek Farm, Eston 1932, was painted in faded letters across its side. With his options limited to either waiting for a passing car or seeking help, Mike began walking toward what he hoped was a working farm. What he couldn't know was that this unexpected detour would lead to a discovery that would transform not only his business plans, but the future of the entire Cedar Creek Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dirt road seemed to stretch endlessly before Mike as he made his way toward the farmhouse. At 42, Michael Rivera had built RiverTech Solutions from a startup in his garage to a company valued at over $200 million. His water management technology had revolutionized irrigation efficiency for industrial agriculture operations across 3 states. The company's proprietary systems reduced water usage by nearly 30% while maintaining crop yields, an innovation that had earned him features in Forbes and Fast Company as one of the rising stars in agricultural technology. But as he trudged down the dusty driveway, his tailored suit collecting fine dust and his forehead beading with sweat, none of that mattered. He was simply a stranded traveler hoping for a working phone and perhaps some local knowledge about the nearest mechanic. This trip to Cedar Creek Valley was supposed to be low-key, a preliminary scouting mission before bringing in the development team. RiverTech had identified the valley as an ideal location for their ambitious new demonstration project. The locals didn't know it yet, but Mike was planning to transform their struggling agricultural community with the largest water technology innovation hub in the western states. The farmhouse came into view as Mike rounded a bend in the road. A 2-story white clapboard structure with a wide front porch and blue shutters stood sentinel over expansive fields. Beyond it, a large red barn and several outbuildings dotted the property. What caught Mike's attention, however, was not the picturesque farm setting, but the lush greenness of the fields surrounding the property. In a region suffering from its 5th consecutive year of drought, when neighboring farms showed signs of water stress with browning edges and stunted growth, this farm seemed to be thriving. As Mike approached the house, he noticed details that intrigued his professional eye. A series of what appeared to be rain catchment systems connected the buildings. Unusual landscaping surrounded the house, not the ornamental gardens one might expect, but concentric patterns of vegetation that seemed both decorative and functional. Most curious was a network of narrow channels running between sections of the property, reminiscent of ancient irrigation methods he'd once studied in a history of agriculture course. He had just reached the porch steps when a voice called out from the direction of the barn, "Can I help you?" Mike turned to see a man in his early 50s approaching, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-weathered skin and eyes crinkled from years of squinting into the distance. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms hardened by physical labor. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in their surroundings, carrying a wrench that suggested he'd been in the middle of repairs. "I'm sorry to intrude," Mike began, gesturing back toward the road. "My car overheated about half a mile back. I was hoping I might use your phone to call for assistance." The man studied him for a moment, taking in the expensive suit now wilted from the heat and the walk. Despite his disheveled appearance, Mike maintained the poised demeanor that had served him well in countless business negotiations. "I'm Thomas Wilson," the man said finally, extending a calloused hand. "Welcome to Willow Creek Farm." "Michael Rivera," Mike replied, shaking Thomas's hand and noting the firm grip. "I appreciate any help you can offer." "Phone's in the house," Thomas said, "but I can take a look at your car first if you'd like. Might save you the cost of a tow truck. Nearest service station is all the way in Millfield, and Jenkins charges double for calls from out of town." Mike hesitated, unaccustomed to accepting help from strangers. In his world, services were contracted, employees delegated, and problems solved through the efficient application of resources. The offer of personal assistance from this farmer felt like a relic from another era. "That would be incredibly helpful," he said finally. "Thank you." Thomas nodded and headed toward a nearby shed. "Let me grab my toolkit. You can wait in the shade if you'd like. Sarah," he called toward the house, "can you bring out some water for our visitor?" The screen door opened, and a woman in her mid-20s stepped onto the porch. With her father's eyes and a similar practical demeanor, she carried a pitcher of water and glasses on a tray. "Dad said your car broke down," she said, pouring a glass and handing it to Mike. "I'm Sarah Wilson." "Michael Rivera," he replied, accepting the water gratefully. The first sip revealed it wasn't store-bought, but cool, fresh water with a subtle, mineral taste he hadn't experienced since childhood visits to his grandfather's rural home. "This water is excellent," he commented. "It's from our spring," Sarah explained, "part of Dad's system." Before Mike could inquire further, Thomas emerged from the shed, driving an old blue pickup truck. "Hop in," he offered, opening the passenger door. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The drive back to Mike's stranded sedan was brief but revealing. Thomas explained that Willow Creek Farm had been in his family for 3 generations, though many neighboring properties had been sold to larger agricultural corporations over the years. "Most family farms around here are struggling," Thomas said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The drought's been hard, and the big operations keep pushing for water rights. Costs go up, prices stay down. It's a familiar story." "Yet your fields look remarkably healthy," Mike observed. Thomas glanced at him, a hint of pride crossing his features. "We've adapted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Had to. They reached Mike's car, steam no longer rising, but the hood still warm to the touch. Thomas examined the engine with practiced efficiency, checking hoses and the radiator cap. "Blown head gasket," he diagnosed after several minutes. "Not something I can fix here. You'll need a proper mechanic, and probably at least 2 days for parts and labor." Mike's carefully planned schedule collapsed in his mind. He was supposed to meet with a water rights attorney in Westridge tomorrow morning, followed by a call with the development team. "Is there a car rental place nearby?" he asked, mentally calculating distances and timing. Thomas shook his head. "Nearest one's in Westridge, about 90 miles east. I can drive you there, but it would take most of the day." He hesitated, then offered, "You're welcome to use our landline to make your calls, and I can give you a ride to the Millfield Inn. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean. Or," he added, seeming to make a decision. "We have a spare room, if you'd prefer. My daughter makes a mean beef stew, and it beats whatever they're serving at the diner tonight." Lately, the offer surprised Mike. In his world, such hospitality towards strangers was rare. His instinct was to decline, to maintain the professional distance he was accustomed to. Yet something about Thomas Wilson's straightforward manner and the mystery of his thriving farm in drought conditions piqued his curiosity. "That's very generous," Mike said. "If you're sure it's no imposition, I'd appreciate it." As they loaded Mike's overnight bag and laptop case into the truck, he couldn't help but notice more details about the farm. What had initially appeared to be standard irrigation systems revealed unusual modifications upon closer inspection. Pipes that shouldn't connect did. Water flowed in patterns that defied conventional agricultural practice. Something interesting was happening at Willow Creek Farm, something that might be relevant to RiverTech's plans for the valley. Thomas drove them back to the farmhouse, pointing out features of the property along the way. "That western section used to be alfalfa, but we converted it to drought-resistant wheat 3 years ago," he explained. "The southern fields rotate between vegetables for the farmers' market and cover crops to rebuild the soil." The casual mention of soil rebuilding caught Mike's attention. It wasn't language typically used by conventional farmers focused on maximizing annual yields. When they returned to the farmhouse, Sarah had set a pitcher of iced tea on the porch. "I've made up the guest room," she told Mike. "The phone's in the kitchen whenever you need it." "Thank you," Mike replied, then turned to Thomas. "Before I make those calls, I'd be interested to hear more about your operation here. I couldn't help but notice your fields are thriving despite the drought conditions." Thomas exchanged a glance with his daughter, a silent communication passing between them. "Let me get cleaned up," Thomas said. "Then I'll show you something that might interest you." While Thomas washed up, Mike made his necessary calls, arranging for a tow truck that wouldn't arrive until morning, rescheduling his meeting with the water rights attorney, and sending a brief update to his business partner, Robert Keller. He deliberately kept his explanation vague, mentioning only car trouble without specifying his current location. Robert had a tendency to micromanage, and Mike preferred to explore this unexpected situation without interference. As he hung up the phone, his gaze drifted to a framed certificate on the kitchen wall, Watershed Management Innovation Award, presented to Thomas Wilson, Willow Creek Farm. The date was 3 years earlier, and the presenter was the State Agricultural Extension Office, a modest accolade compared to the industry awards that lined Mike's office walls, but intriguing nonetheless. "Ready for that tour?" Thomas asked, appearing in the doorway. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the farm as Thomas led Mike toward what appeared to be an ordinary irrigation pond. As they drew closer, Mike realized it was anything but ordinary. The pond was part of an elaborate water management system that included underground channels, filtration areas densely planted with specific vegetation, and a series of cascading pools. "We call this our water conservation circuit," Thomas explained. "It captures every drop of rain that falls on the property, filters it naturally through these plant zones, and stores it in a network of underground cisterns." Mike's professional interest was fully engaged now. This wasn't just clever farming. This was sophisticated water engineering implemented with surprisingly simple materials. "This is remarkable," he said, professional admiration evident in his voice. "How many gallons can you store?" "Nearly 2 million at full capacity," Thomas replied, "enough to maintain essential operations through 18 months of drought when properly managed." The figure was impressive, especially for a family farm operation. Most agricultural properties this size would struggle after just 2 months without rainfall. "And you designed this yourself?" Thomas nodded. "It evolved over time. My grandfather started with basic rainwater harvesting during the Dust Bowl. My father expanded the pond system in the 70s. I've been refining it since taking over the farm 20 years ago, adding the biofiltration zones and underground storage. As they continued walking the property, Thomas explained how each element interconnected. The system didn't just store water, it created a closed loop that mimicked natural watershed functions. Runoff from fields was captured and filtered. Evaporation was minimized through innovative covers. Even morning dew was collected from certain surfaces. Most modern agricultural operations treat water as a disposable resource, Thomas said, as they paused by a field edge where a narrow channel disappeared underground. They pump it from wells or divert it from rivers, use it once, and let the excess run off, carrying topsoil and fertilizers with it. We've designed our entire farm to function as a watershed. Mike was increasingly impressed. What Thomas was describing aligned with theoretical models RiverTech had been developing, but hadn't yet fully implemented. Here, on this seemingly ordinary family farm, those principles had been put into practice through decades of incremental innovation. "You mentioned your daughter makes a mean beef stew," Mike said, as they walked back toward the house, the sun beginning to set behind the western mountains. "I'd love to hear more about your system over dinner if you're willing to share." Something in Thomas's expression shifted, a flicker of wariness, then consideration. "I'm happy to share our approach," he said carefully, "though I should mention that several large agricultural companies have sent representatives in the past interested in parts of our system. They typically want to extract specific techniques they can patent and commercialize, rather than understanding the integrated approach that makes it successful." The comment gave Mike pause. Thomas Wilson clearly wasn't a simple farmer, but a sophisticated systems thinker who understood both the technical and commercial implications of his innovations. "I should introduce myself more properly," Mike said, extending his hand again. "Michael Rivera, CEO of RiverTech Solutions. We specialize in water management technology for agricultural applications." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. "RiverTech. You're the company that developed the smart flow irrigation system. You're familiar with our work." "I try to stay informed about developments in agricultural water management," Thomas replied, his tone neutral. "Your technology has impressive efficiency ratings in controlled conditions." There was an unspoken but in his response that Mike caught immediately. Before he could inquire further, Sarah appeared on the porch to announce that dinner was ready. The farmhouse interior surprised Mike. While the architecture was vintage, the kitchen featured updated appliances, and the living areas were comfortably appointed with a blend of antiques and modern furniture. One wall displayed family photographs showing generations of Wilsons working the same land. Another held bookshelves filled with volumes on agriculture, water engineering, ecology, and surprisingly, several technical journals Mike recognized from his own reading list. Dinner was simple but delicious. Beef stew made with vegetables from the farm, homemade bread, and a salad of greens Mike didn't recognize. "These are remarkable," he said, indicating the greens. "I don't think I've tasted anything like them." "Drought-resistant heritage varieties," Sarah explained, "part of my research project." "Sarah has a degree in environmental science from UC Davis," Thomas added with evident pride. "She's been developing drought-resistant vegetable varieties adapted specifically to our microclimate." "That's fascinating," Mike said, looking at Sarah with new interest. "Are you using genetic modification techniques?" "No need," she replied. "We're using selective breeding combined with soil microbiology. The plants develop drought resistance naturally when grown in relationship with the right fungal and bacterial communities." The conversation flowed easily through dinner, moving from practical farming techniques to broader questions of agricultural sustainability. Mike found himself engaged on both professional and personal levels, challenged by perspectives that simultaneously aligned with and diverged from his own thinking. After the meal, Thomas invited Mike to join him on the porch where the cooling evening air carried the scent of nearby sage. In the distance, the lights of scattered farmhouses twinkled like earthbound stars. "So, Mr. Rivera," Thomas said, settling into a wooden rocking chair, "what brings a tech CEO to Cedar Creek Valley? I'm guessing it wasn't just to have your car break down on our road." Mike smiled, recognizing that Thomas had been waiting for the right moment to ask this question. He considered his response carefully. His usual approach with potential project sites was to maintain confidentiality until formal announcements, but something about Thomas Wilson inspired a different approach. "I'm here on a preliminary site assessment," he admitted. "RiverTech is planning a major project, what we're calling a water innovation hub. It would include demonstration facilities for our latest technologies, research facilities, and training centers for agricultural professionals." "And you're considering this valley?" Thomas asked, his expression thoughtful. Mike nodded. "The geography is ideal. The valley's water challenges are representative of issues facing agricultural regions throughout the West. And frankly, the economic situation makes land acquisition feasible." "You mean farms going under because of the drought makes them cheap?" "Dubai," Thomas translated, no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. "That's part of it," Mike acknowledged. "But we also see an opportunity to revitalize the region. The hub would create jobs, bring in research funding, and implement water management systems that could benefit the entire watershed." Thomas was silent for a moment, rocking gently as he gazed out at the valley. "Your technology focuses on maximizing efficiency within existing agricultural paradigms," he said finally. "Sensors, automated controls, precision application, all valuable tools, but they address symptoms rather than underlying causes." "What would you consider the underlying causes?" Mike asked, genuinely curious. "Disconnection," Thomas replied. Simply, modern agriculture has disconnected water management from natural systems. We've straightened streams that should meander. We've drained wetlands that should store floodwaters. We've sealed surfaces that should absorb rainwater. Every improvement has broken another link in the natural water cycle. The observation resonated with questions that had been forming at the edges of Mike's thinking. RiverTech's technologies were undeniably effective at optimizing water use within conventional agricultural operations, but they operated within a framework that treated symptoms of water scarcity rather than addressing root causes. "What you've built here," Mike said, gesturing toward the darkened fields where the water system lay, "isn't just about efficiency. It's about reimagining the relationship between agriculture and natural water systems." "That's it exactly." Thomas nodded, pleased at Mike's understanding. "Efficiency is necessary but insufficient. Resilience requires working with natural patterns rather than imposing engineering solutions that fight against them." As the evening progressed, their conversation deepened. Mike found himself sharing professional doubts he rarely voiced, even to his business partner. The tension between RiverTech's commercial interests and the more fundamental transformations needed in agricultural water management. The limitations of technologies that improved efficiency without addressing underlying system failures. "Sometimes I wonder if we're just creating better tools for a broken system," he admitted. Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them. "That's the central question, isn't it? Do we optimize processes within flawed systems, or do we reimagine the systems themselves?" After Thomas had retired for the evening, Mike remained on the porch, looking out at the valley bathed in moonlight. The Cedar Creek Valley had initially represented a strategic business opportunity for RiverTech. Favorable geography, economic conditions ripe for development, and water challenges that showcase their technologies. But his conversation with Thomas Wilson had stirred questions that transcended business strategy. What if RiverTech's approach was fundamentally limited? What if true innovation meant not just technological advancement, but systemic reimagining? And what would it mean to develop the valley not just as a demonstration site for existing technologies, but as a laboratory for a fundamentally different approach to agricultural water management? Sometime after midnight, Mike finally headed to the guest room, his mind still turning over these questions. As he drifted towards sleep, images of Thomas's integrated water system merged with RiverTech's technological innovations in ways he hadn't previously considered. Not competitors, but complements, each addressing different aspects of the same fundamental challenges. Tomorrow, he would see more of Willow Creek Farm, understanding better how Thomas had created a thriving agricultural operation in the midst of drought. And perhaps in that understanding, he might find a new vision, not just for RiverTech's planned development, but for the future of Cedar Creek Valley itself. Morning arrived with the scent of coffee and the distant sound of farm equipment. Mike dressed and made his way to the kitchen, where Sarah was preparing breakfast. "Dad's already out checking the irrigation sensors," she explained, pouring him coffee. "He said to tell you the tow truck called. They'll be here by 10 to take your car to Jenkins' shop in Millfield." "Thank you," Mike said, accepting the mug. "Your father's water management system is remarkable. How much of the farm does it cover?" "All of it," Sarah replied, cracking eggs into a bowl. "But it's not just a water system. That's what makes it different from most engineered solutions. It's integrated with every aspect of the farm, the soil management, the crop selection, even the positioning of structures and roads. Everything is designed to work with the natural water cycle rather than against it." As they talked, Mike gained a deeper understanding of the Wilson approach to farming. Sarah had returned to Willow Creek after completing her environmental science degree, bringing new research insights to complement her father's practical knowledge. Together, they had further refined the farm's integrated water and soil management systems. "Most people don't realize how much water is lost through degraded soil," Sarah explained as she served a breakfast of eggs, homemade bread, and fresh fruit. "When soil organic matter decreases by just 1%, that soil loses the ability to hold nearly 20,000 gallons of water per acre. Industrial agriculture has been depleting soil organic matter for decades." "And you've been rebuilding it," Mike guessed. "Exactly. Dad's water system captures and distributes the water, but healthy soil is what holds it where plants can access it. They're two halves of the same approach." After breakfast, Sarah led Mike to a small building behind the main house that he had assumed was a storage shed. Inside, he discovered a sophisticated monitoring station where computers displayed real-time data from sensors throughout the property. "This is our nerve center," Sarah explained. "We track soil moisture at different depths, monitor water flow through the system, and collect climate data. The software is pretty basic compared to what companies like yours develop, but it gives us the information we need." Mike studied the displays with professional interest. The monitoring system was indeed simpler than RiverTech's offerings, but it was elegantly designed to track the specific parameters most relevant to the Wilson's integrated approach. "Did you develop this software yourselves?" he asked. "Dad created the initial version years ago. I updated it after college, and we've been refining it since. We share it with other farmers in the watershed group. That's 8 farms now that have implemented at least parts of our approach." "There are others using these methods?" Sarah nodded. "On different scales. The Rodriguez farm implemented the water catchment system 3 years ago. The Andersons focused on soil regeneration. Eleanor Nguyen, who's on the town council, has been coordinating efforts to apply some of these principles to public lands around Millfield. The existence of a nascent network implementing Thomas's approaches added another dimension to Mike's evolving thoughts about RiverTech's plans for the valley. Thomas joined them mid-morning, just as the tow truck arrived for Mike's car. "Jenkins says he can probably have your car fixed by tomorrow afternoon," Thomas reported after speaking with the driver. "Parts need to come from Westridge." "I appreciate all your help," Mike said, "and I'd like to see more of your operation if you're willing. There might be potential for collaboration between what you're doing here and what RiverTech is planning for the valley." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "Let me show you something that might help you understand our approach better." He led Mike to his truck, and they drove to a ridge overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, the differences between Willow Creek Farm and neighboring properties were starkly visible. The Wilson field showed healthy growth patterns with natural contours following the land's topography. Adjacent corporate farms featured rigid geometric plantings with visible signs of water stress. Cedar Creek Valley was once one of the most naturally water-rich areas in the region, Thomas explained, pointing to the creek that gave the valley its name. The creek used to meander across the valley floor, creating wetlands that stored water during wet periods and released it slowly during dry times. Starting in the 1950s, the creek was channelized for flood control and to maximize farmable acreage. He gestured toward the straight-line drainage ditches that now characterize the valley's hydrology. Every improvement made the valley more vulnerable to drought. We straightened the creek so water rushes through instead of lingering. We filled wetlands, eliminating natural storage. We compacted soil with heavy equipment, reducing its ability to absorb rainfall. We removed native vegetation that helped slow and filter water movement. Mike understood the pattern Thomas was describing. It was the same story that had played out across agricultural landscapes nationwide. Short-term productivity gains achieved through modifications that undermined long-term resilience. "Your system is basically recreating the functions of the original watershed," Mike realized. "But doing it at the farm scale?" Thomas nodded, pleased at Mike's understanding. "Exactly. We can't restore the entire valley to its natural state. There's too much development, too many competing interests. But we can recreate the functional elements of a healthy watershed within our property boundaries. And if enough farms did the same, the cumulative effect would be transformation at the valley scale." As they drove back toward the farm, Mike's mind was racing with implications. RiverTech's planned water innovation hub had been conceived as a showcase for their technological solutions: sensors, automated irrigation systems, and predictive software. But what if it could be something more? What if it could demonstrate the integration of advanced technology with the kind of systems-based approach Thomas had developed? "Thomas," Mike said as they parked near the barn, "what would you think about working with RiverTech to develop the Innovation Hub, not just as a technology showcase, but as a center for integrated water management that combines your approach with our resources and reach?" Thomas looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I've had companies approach me before about my water system. They typically want to extract specific techniques they can commercialize without understanding the integrated approach that makes it successful. That's not what I'm suggesting," Mike clarified. "I'm talking about a true collaboration. Your knowledge of integrated watershed management combined with our technological capabilities and resources. Together, we might create something neither of us could build alone." Before Thomas could respond, a new truck pulled into the driveway. Sarah emerged from the house to greet the visitor, a Vietnamese-American woman in her 50s with an air of quiet authority. "That's Eleanor Nguyen," Thomas explained. "Town council member I mentioned. We have a watershed group meeting this afternoon. Farmers and community members working on regional water issues." "Would you mind if I attended?" Mike asked. "It might give me a better understanding of the valley's challenges and how RiverTech's plans might best address them." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. It's an open meeting. Might be good for them to hear directly what you're planning. The meeting, held in the Wilsons' barn, which had been set up with chairs and a projector, brought together about 20 people. Farmers of various ages, small business owners from Millfield, and several younger residents who Sarah later explained were part of a local sustainability initiative. Eleanor Nguyen facilitated with calm efficiency. As Mike observed the discussion, he was struck by the sophistication of their approach. These weren't simply farmers complaining about water shortages. They were engaged citizens collectively addressing complex watershed issues. They discussed recent soil test results showing improvement in water retention capacity. They reviewed rainfall data and aquifer measurements. They coordinated plans for implementing additional water-saving measures before the driest months arrived. When Thomas introduced Mike and explained his presence, there was understandable wariness in the room. RiverTech is considering developing a water innovation hub in our valley, Eleanor summarized, looking directly at Mike. Perhaps you'd like to tell us more about these plans, Mr. Rivera? Standing before the group, Mike found himself at a crossroads. His original intention had been to conduct preliminary site assessments quietly, with public announcements carefully managed through RiverTech's marketing department after plans were finalized. But facing these community members who were already actively engaged in addressing the very issues his project aimed to tackle, the standard corporate approach felt wrong. I came to Cedar Creek Valley to evaluate its suitability for a major RiverTech development, he began candidly. What we've envisioned is a center showcasing advanced water management technologies with research facilities and training programs. He paused, looking around the room and seeing a mix of curiosity, skepticism and concern. But what I've learned since my car broke down yesterday, particularly from Thomas and Sarah Wilson, has me rethinking our approach. The technological solutions RiverTech offers are valuable, but they're most effective when integrated with the kind of systems-based watershed management you're already developing here. Mike described a new vision taking shape in his mind, not a corporate showcase imposed on the valley, but a collaborative center that built upon the community's existing knowledge and efforts, amplifying them with additional resources and technological capabilities. I believe there's potential for a partnership that benefits both RiverTech and Cedar Creek Valley, he concluded, not by replacing what you're doing, but by supporting and expanding it. The response was cautious but engaged. Community members asked pointed questions about water rights, land acquisition, and corporate control, all legitimate concerns given the history of large companies entering rural communities with grand promises that often failed to materialize as advertised. We've seen corporate interest in our valley before, an older farmer named Jim Peterson commented. Usually ends with outside investors making money while locals lose control of their resources. That's a fair concern, Mike acknowledged. What I'm proposing would be structured as a true partnership with shared governance and clear protections for local water rights and land use. As the meeting continued, the conversation evolved from skepticism toward cautious possibility. Eleanor suggested forming a working group to explore the potential collaboration further. Several farmers expressed interest in how RiverTech's technologies might complement their existing practices. Thomas remained measured but engaged, asking questions that helped shape the emerging concept. By the time the meeting ended with plans for follow-up discussions, Mike had gained valuable insights into both the challenges facing Cedar Creek Valley and the remarkable community already working to address them. More importantly, he'd begun to envision a fundamentally different approach to RiverTech's development, one that might integrate corporate resources with community knowledge in unprecedented ways. As the participants departed, Thomas invited Mike, Sarah, and Eleanor to continue the conversation over dinner. Seated around the Wilsons' kitchen table, they delved deeper into possibilities and concerns. "Your vision sounds promising," Eleanor said. "Whoa, but the details matter enormously. Who would control water rights? How would decisions be made? What protections would ensure the community benefits long-term?" "All critical questions," Mike agreed. "I believe we could develop a framework that addresses them. Perhaps a cooperative governance structure with clear checks and balances." "What about your investors and board?" Thomas asked pragmatically. "Corporate priorities tend to override community considerations when profits are at stake." The question cut to the heart of the challenge Mike knew he would face. RiverTech's board, particularly his business partner Robert Keller, expected developments that maximized return on investment. The kind of collaborative, community-centered approach emerging from these discussions would require a fundamental rethinking of corporate priorities. "I won't pretend that will be easy," Mike admitted, "but I believe I can make a compelling case that this approach not only serves the community, but makes sound business sense long-term." Sustainable water management is becoming critical nationwide. A successful model here could be replicated in agricultural regions throughout the West. As the evening progressed, what had begun as cautious exploration evolved into increasingly concrete planning. Sarah sketched potential integration points between RiverTech's technologies and the watershed restoration principles already guiding the community's efforts. Eleanor identified regulatory requirements and potential funding sources beyond corporate investment. Thomas provided practical insights about implementation challenges and opportunities. By the time Mike returned to the guest room for his second unexpected night at Willow Creek Farm, a new vision had taken shape, not fully formed, but compelling in its potential. What had begun as a standard corporate development might instead become a groundbreaking collaboration between private enterprise and community wisdom, technology, and ecological knowledge, profit motive, and watershed health. As he prepared for bed, Mike's phone lit up with multiple messages from Robert Keller, his business partner. The latest was direct. "Where are you? Why aren't you responding? We have investors expecting updates on the Cedar Creek site assessment." Mike composed a brief reply. "Car trouble extended my stay, making valuable local connections. Will call tomorrow with important new perspectives on the project." He set the phone aside, knowing that the conversation with Robert would be challenging. His partner was firmly committed to RiverTech's established approach, developing proprietary technologies that could be licensed at premium prices to large agricultural operations. The community-integrated model taking shape in Mike's mind represented a significant departure, but as he drifted towards sleep, Mike felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The chance breakdown that had stranded him at Willow Creek Farm hadn't just introduced him to an innovative water management system, it had reconnected him with the underlying mission that had inspired RiverTech's creation in the first place, developing solutions that created genuine water resilience in a changing climate. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Explaining his evolving vision to Robert, negotiating with the board, developing concrete frameworks for collaboration. But for the first time, Mike felt he was moving towards something that integrated RiverTech's technological capabilities with the deeper wisdom of place and community, embodied by Thomas Wilson and the Cedar Creek Watershed Group. What had begun as a simple car breakdown on a country road was evolving into something neither he nor Thomas could have anticipated. A partnership that might transform not just Cedar Creek Valley, but the very approach to agricultural water management across regions facing similar challenges. The seeds of this unexpected collaboration were just beginning to sprout, but they held promise for a harvest more abundant than either man could have cultivated alone. The morning light streamed through the curtains of the guest room as Mike woke to the distant sounds of farm machinery. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above him a stark contrast to his minimalist penthouse apartment in Westridge. Then the events of the past day came flooding back. The car breakdown, Thomas Wilson's remarkable water management system, and the watershed meeting that had sparked a new vision for RiverTech's Cedar Creek Valley project. Reaching for his phone, Mike grimaced at the series of increasingly urgent messages from Robert Keller. His business partner wasn't known for patience at the best of times, and radio silence from Mike was clearly pushing his limits. Rather than responding to the messages, Mike dialed Robert's number directly. Better to have this conversation voice to voice than attempt to explain such a significant shift in thinking via text. Finally, Robert answered on the second ring, his tone clipped. "Where have you been? The board is expecting preliminary assessments today." "Car trouble," Mike explained, keeping his tone casual. "Blown head gasket. I've been staying with a local farmer while it gets fixed." "A farmer?" The disbelief in Robert's voice was evident. "Why didn't you just rent a car and get back to civilization?" "Because this particular farmer turned out to be developing water management systems that make our technology look like a stopgap measure," Mike replied, deciding that directness was the best approach. "Robert, I think we need to reconsider our approach to the Cedar Creek project." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Reconsider how exactly?" Robert finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. Mike outlined what he'd discovered at Willow Creek Farm, the integrated water management system that worked with natural watershed processes rather than against them, the community network already implementing aspects of this approach, and the potential for a collaborative model that would integrate RiverTech's technology with these ecological principles. "So instead of our planned technology showcase, you want to partner with some farmer and his friends?" Robert's skepticism came through clearly. "Mike, we have investors expecting a clear return on the Cedar Creek development. They're not interested in feel-good community projects." "This isn't about feeling good," Mike countered, his conviction growing as he articulated the vision taking shape in his mind. "It's about developing a truly effective approach to agricultural water management. Thomas Wilson's system achieves better results with less technology because it works with natural processes. If we could integrate our advanced monitoring and control systems with his approach, we'd have something revolutionary. Not just more efficient use of water, but actual watershed regeneration." "That sounds great for a research paper, but how does it translate to product lines and revenue streams?" Robert pressed. "Our business model depends on proprietary technology we can license at scale." "I'm not suggesting abandoning our technology," Mike clarified, pacing the guest room. "I'm talking about evolving it, creating systems that support integrated watershed management rather than just isolated efficiency improvements. The market for that could be enormous as water scarcity intensifies globally." Their conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, Robert raising practical objections about investor expectations, development timelines, and market positioning, while Mike outlined an alternative vision that he believed could ultimately prove more valuable, both economically and ecologically. They ended without resolution, agreeing to reconvene with the full board once Mike returned to Westridge. As Mike dressed and made his way downstairs, he felt simultaneously energized by the possibilities he saw and concerned about the institutional resistance they would face. RiverTech had built its success on a particular approach to water technology, one that worked within existing agricultural paradigms rather than challenging them. What he was now contemplating represented not just a project adjustment, but a fundamental strategic shift. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be soil samples for analysis. "Dad's checking the Northfield irrigation," she informed him, looking up from her work. Jenkins called from the garage. Your car should be ready by late afternoon. Thank you, Mike replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. Would it be possible to see more of your monitoring system before I leave? I'm particularly interested in how you're tracking soil moisture at different depths. Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You're actually serious about this collaboration idea, aren't you? Not just extracting techniques. To commercialize. I am, Mike confirmed, though I should be honest, convincing my business partner and board will be challenging. They're accustomed to a particular approach to technology development and commercialization. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. That's usually where these conversations break down. Companies express interest in what we're doing, but once they understand it can't be neatly packaged and scaled without the broader ecological context, they lose interest. She set aside her soil samples and gestured for Mike to follow her outside. Let me show you something that might help you understand why we're so protective of our approach. They walked to a section of the property bordered by a neighbor's field. The contrast was striking. Willow Creek Farm's soil appeared dark and rich, supporting diverse vegetation, while the neighboring field showed signs of degradation with lighter-colored soil and struggling crops despite evidence of intensive irrigation. This farm was owned by the Martinez family for generations, Sarah explained. 3 years ago, they sold to Agrivast Corporation. Since then, the soil organic matter has decreased by nearly 40%. Water retention capacity has dropped proportionally. They're now irrigating at twice the rate we are, with yields declining year by year. Because they're treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying system, Mike observed. Exactly. They're applying more water, more fertilizer, more pesticides, fighting against the land's natural processes rather than working with them. Eventually, they'll deplete the soil so severely it won't be economically viable to farm, even with intensive inputs. As they continued their tour, Sarah showed Mike the network of sensors that monitored conditions throughout the property: soil moisture at multiple depths, water flow through the catchment system, atmospheric conditions that affected evaporation rates. The data collected fed into models that help the Wilsons anticipate needs and adjust their management practices proactively. Most agricultural monitoring systems focus on determining when to irrigate, Sarah explained, as they examined a small weather station that contributed to the farm's data ecosystem. Our system helps us understand how water is moving through the entire farm system, not just when plants need water, but how to ensure that water is available where and when it's needed through natural processes as much as possible. They had reached a small orchard where fruit trees grew among companion plants that Sarah explained helped manage pests naturally while enhancing soil biology. The technology you've developed at RiverTech is impressive, she acknowledged. The precision irrigation and real-time monitoring could integrate beautifully with our approach, but they need to serve the ecosystem rather than just extract from it more efficiently. Mike was struck by her articulation of exactly what he'd been contemplating since his first glimpse of Willow Creek Farm's integrated system. Technology should support healthy ecological processes, not simply minimize the damage caused by fundamentally flawed approaches. That's the collaboration I'm envisioning, he said. Not imposing our technology on your approach, but evolving our technology to support integrated watershed management. They returned to the monitoring shed, where Sarah showed him the software interface they'd developed to visualize data from throughout the property. Though less polished than RiverTech's sleek applications, it displayed relationships between variables that most agricultural monitoring systems ignored: how changes in soil biology affected water retention, how vegetation patterns influenced moisture distribution, how the timing of management practices impacted overall system resilience. Dad's been wanting to expand the monitoring network to include more farms in the watershed, Sarah mentioned as she pulled up historical data showing the farm's increasing drought resilience over time. The equipment costs are the main limitation. Most family farms can't afford comprehensive sensor arrays. That's something RiverTech could potentially contribute, Mike noted, seeing an immediate practical application for collaboration. We've developed low-cost sensor networks specifically for agricultural applications. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, who had completed his morning field checks. "How's the North Field looking?" Sarah asked. "Soil moisture holding well despite no irrigation for 2 weeks," Thomas replied, pouring himself coffee. "The new cover crop mix is performing even better than expected." He turned to Mike. "I caught the end of your conversation. Sarah showing you our monitoring system. She is. The integration of data across different aspects of the farm ecosystem is impressive. Most agricultural monitoring focuses on isolated parameters rather than relationships between them." Thomas nodded. "That's the fundamental difference in our approach. Conventional agriculture manages pieces in isolation, water separate from soil biology, crops separate from ecosystem services. We're trying to manage relationships and flows rather than just inputs and outputs." They spent the next hour discussing potential intersections between RiverTech's technologies and Willow Creek Farm's integrated management approach. Thomas was cautiously receptive to Mike's vision of collaboration, though his questions revealed concerns about corporate priorities, potentially overwhelming community needs. "The technology isn't the challenge," Thomas observed as they shared lunch on the porch. "It's the governance structure and decision-making framework. How do you ensure the community's voice isn't drowned out when corporate interests and profit motives enter the equation?" It was a question Mike had been contemplating since the previous evening's discussion with Eleanor and Sarah. The traditional corporate development model, where a company acquired land and implemented projects based primarily on shareholder interests, seemed fundamentally incompatible with the community-centered ecosystem-based approach needed here. "What if we created a new entity?" Mike suggested, the idea forming as he spoke. "A benefit corporation or cooperative structure with shared governance between RiverTech, participating farms, and community representatives. Technology and resources from our side, ecological knowledge, and community wisdom from yours." The concept sparked an animated discussion about potential governance models, decision-making structures, and mechanisms to ensure long-term accountability. By the time they finished lunch, the theoretical collaboration had begun to take more concrete form in their shared understanding. As Thomas left to meet with a neighboring farmer about potential watershed improvements, Mike found himself alone on the porch, contemplating the significance of the ideas they'd been discussing. What had begun as a standard corporate site assessment had evolved into something far more profound, the potential reimagining of his company's entire approach to agricultural water management. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jenkins from the garage in Millfield. "Mr. Rivera, your car's all fixed up. Head gasket replaced, cooling system checked out. You're good to go whenever you're ready." Mike thanked him and ended the call, feeling a surprising reluctance at the prospect of leaving Willow Creek Farm. In just over 24 hours, this unexpected detour had opened perspectives that might never have emerged in RiverTech's carefully controlled development process. Sarah joined him on the porch, carrying a folder of documents. "These are some of the papers Dad's published on our water management approach," she explained, handing him the folder. "They're mostly in smaller agricultural journals rather than mainstream scientific publications, but the data and methodologies are solid. Might help you make your case to your board." "Thank you," Mike said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "My car's ready in Millfield. I should probably head back to Westridge this afternoon." Sarah nodded. "Dad mentioned you two discussed potential governance models for a collaboration. He was impressed by your receptiveness to community involvement in decision-making. That's rare in corporate partnerships. This would need to be something different from a standard corporate project," Mike acknowledged. "The value emerges from the integration of approaches and knowledge systems. That can't happen if one side dominates decision-making." Before Sarah could respond, a new vehicle pulled into the driveway, a sleek black SUV that looked jarringly out of place in the farm setting. Mike immediately recognized it as a RiverTech company vehicle, and his heart sank slightly at the implications. Only one person would have tracked him down here. Robert Keller emerged from the driver's side, his crisp business attire and impatient stride marking him immediately as an outsider in this environment. Mike rose to greet his business partner, aware of Sarah watching with understandable wariness. "Robert, I wasn't expecting you to drive out here." "Clearly," Robert replied, his tone clipped. "When you didn't return my calls after our conversation. This morning, I decided this situation warranted direct intervention. The board meeting has been moved up. We need the Cedar Creek assessment finalized." Mike introduced Sarah, who greeted Robert with polite reserve. The contrast between the two was striking. Robert with his carefully tailored appearance and urban confidence, Sarah grounded and practical in work clothes, still bearing traces of the morning's soil analysis. Miss Wilson was just providing me with research documentation on their water management approach, Mike explained, indicating the folder. "It's directly relevant to our Cedar Creek planning." Robert glanced at the folder with barely disguised skepticism. "I'm sure it's fascinating, but we have a development timeline to maintain. The land acquisition team is waiting on your assessment to proceed with offers." The casual reference to land acquisition sent a chill through Mike. The RiverTech development plan included purchasing several struggling farms to create the Innovation Hub campus, potentially including properties belonging to members of the watershed group he'd met the previous evening. "We should discuss some adjustments to that timeline," Mike said carefully. "I've been exploring alternative approaches that might better serve both our long-term interests and the community's needs." Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "We can discuss adjustments on the drive back. Your car's been repaired, correct? You can follow me to Westridge." The conversation's subtext was clear. Robert wanted to extract Mike from what he perceived as a distracting local entanglement and refocus him on the established corporate agenda. Before Mike could respond, Thomas's truck appeared on the driveway, returning from his meeting with the neighboring farmer. Introductions were made with Thomas exhibiting the same measured courtesy that Sarah had shown. Robert maintained professional politeness while clearly impatient to depart. "Mr. Wilson, your farm is quite impressive," Robert acknowledged, with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to business negotiations. "Mike tells me you've developed some interesting water management techniques." "We've been refining our approach for 3 generations," Thomas replied evenly. "Not so much techniques as a system that works with natural processes rather than against them." "Admirable," Robert nodded. "Perhaps there might be elements we could incorporate into our development plans. Mike should certainly include your perspectives in his assessment report." The commodification implicit in Robert's response, reducing Thomas's lifetime of integrated watershed management to elements that might be selectively extracted, highlighted exactly the approach Mike had begun to question. "Robert, what Thomas and his community have developed goes beyond elements we can cherry-pick," Mike interjected. "It's a fundamentally different approach to agricultural water management, one that achieves remarkable results through system-level integration rather than isolated technological interventions." Robert's expression suggested he was mentally calculating how to extract Mike from this situation with minimal disruption to their established plans. As I said, we can discuss adjustments on the drive back. We should get on the road if we're going to make the board meeting tomorrow morning. Mike glanced at Thomas and Sarah, aware that this moment represented a critical juncture. The easy path would be to follow Robert back to Westridge, file a standard site assessment report with perhaps a brief mention of local innovations, and proceed with RiverTech's original development plan. The corporate machinery was already in motion, with land acquisition teams ready to begin purchasing struggling farms for the project. But the past 36 hours had revealed possibilities that wouldn't exist within that conventional corporate framework. The integration of RiverTech's advanced technology with the Wilson approach to watershed management could create something genuinely transformative. Not just more efficient water use, but actual regeneration of agricultural ecosystems. Thomas, would you and Sarah be willing to come to Westridge to present your approach to our board? Mike asked suddenly. Seeing your system firsthand has been invaluable for me. They should have the same opportunity before we finalize development plans for Cedar Creek Valley. The suggestion clearly caught Robert off guard. Mike, the board meeting is for finalizing the assessment, not exploring alternative approaches. We already have the project parameters established. Parameters that might be significantly improved based on what I've learned here, Mike countered firmly. This isn't about abandoning our plans, Robert. It's about evolving them to create something more effective and ultimately more valuable. Thomas considered the invitation thoughtfully. When would this presentation be? Tomorrow morning, Mike replied. I know it's short notice. We've never presented to a corporate board, Sarah noted, her expression revealing both interest and apprehension. You wouldn't be alone, Mike assured her. I'd introduce the context and potential integrations with our technology. Your role would be sharing the science and results behind your approach. Thomas and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent communication, passing between them that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd considered whether to engage with corporate interests. We could bring Eleanor Nguyen as well, Thomas suggested. As a town council member, she could speak to the community perspective on watershed management. Robert's expression made clear he considered this entire conversation a derailment of established plans, but Mike pressed forward. That would be perfect. 3 perspectives: the farm implementation, the scientific foundation, and the community context. Exactly what our board needs to understand before making decisions that will impact Cedar Creek Valley for decades. Thomas nodded slowly. All right, we'll come. Not because we're interested in selling our approach or our land, but because the valley's watershed deserves thoughtful stewardship, regardless of who owns particular parcels. The decision made, practical arrangements followed. Mike would return to Westridge with Robert to prepare for the board meeting and arrange for Thomas, Sarah, and Eleanor to present. The Wilsons would drive to Westridge early the following morning, bringing their research documentation and presentation materials. As Mike packed his overnight bag and prepared to leave Willow Creek Farm, he felt the weight of the path he was choosing. Challenging established corporate directions wasn't without risk, especially when significant investment had already been directed toward a particular development model. Yet the potential to transform RiverTech's approach to agricultural water management, to create something that worked with natural systems rather than simply extracting from them more efficiently, seemed worth the professional risk. Thomas walked with Mike to his now repaired car, Robert waiting impatiently in the company SUV nearby. Your partner doesn't seem convinced about this collaboration concept, Thomas observed quietly. He sees our existing approach as proven and profitable, Mike acknowledged. Changing direction always faces resistance. "What makes you different?" Thomas asked directly. "Most corporate executives who've shown interest in our work ultimately return to their established models once they're back in their boardrooms." The question gave Mike pause. What had changed during his brief time at Willow Creek Farm? It wasn't just seeing an innovative water management system. He'd encountered plenty of agricultural innovations throughout his career. Something more fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what technology should accomplish. "I've spent years developing technologies that make conventional agriculture more water efficient," he replied finally. "But efficiency within a fundamentally flawed system isn't enough. What you've created here addresses the actual relationship between agriculture and watershed health. After seeing that, I can't go back to pretending that better irrigation scheduling or more precise application is sufficient." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer. "We'll see you tomorrow morning then." As Mike drove away from Willow Creek Farm, following Robert's SUV toward Westridge, the rolling landscape of Cedar Creek Valley spread around him. Fields in varying states of health told the story of different management approaches, some thriving despite drought conditions, others showing signs of stress despite intensive irrigation. The contrasts embodied exactly the choice RiverTech faced in its development plans: continue optimizing a flawed approach, or help pioneer a fundamental reimagining of agricultural water management. The drive to Westridge took nearly 2 hours, during which Robert outlined his concerns about deviating from their established development model. The objections were predictable and not without merit. Investor expectations had been set based on particular revenue projections. Development timelines were aligned with market forecasts, and the corporate structure was designed around proprietary technology licensing rather than collaborative ecosystem management. "I understand your enthusiasm for this integrated approach," Robert conceded as they neared the city. "But transforming our entire business model based on one farm's methods is premature at best. We need controlled studies, competitive analysis, market validation." "That's exactly why I want Thomas and Sarah to present to the board," Mike responded. "Their approach already has 15 years of data showing improved drought resilience, reduced input costs, and stable yields under increasingly difficult climate conditions. That's more validation than most of our technologies had before we scaled them." They reached RiverTech's headquarters as evening fell, the modern glass building reflecting the sunset in shades of orange and gold. Mike felt the familiar transition from rural rhythms to corporate pace as they entered the lobby with its sleek design and subtle displays of the company's technological innovations. "I've scheduled the Wilson presentation for 9 tomorrow morning," Mike informed Robert as they parted in the executive suite hallway. "I'll prepare an introduction that frames how their approach might integrate with our technologies." Robert nodded with reluctant acceptance. "I still think this is a distraction from our established development path, but I respect that you're following your convictions. Just remember that the board expects clear pathways to marketable products and services, not ecological philosophy." Alone in his office, Mike spent the evening reviewing the research papers Sarah had provided and preparing his presentation. The documentation was impressive. Detailed data on soil health improvements, water retention capacity, crop resilience during drought conditions, and the economic benefits of reduced input requirements. What emerged most clearly was that the Wilson approach wasn't just environmentally superior, but economically sound over the long term, with initial implementation costs offset by significant operational savings within 3 to 5 years. Around midnight, Mike received a text message from Sarah. "Dad and Eleanor are prepared for tomorrow. Hope your board is ready to think differently about watershed management." The simple message reinforced the significance of what he was attempting. This wasn't merely about adjusting a development plan. It was about challenging the fundamental paradigm that had guided agricultural water technology for decades. The assumption that natural systems needed to be controlled and improved upon, rather than worked with and enhanced. As he finally left the office in the early morning hours, the city lights reflecting off glass towers, Mike found himself thinking about the contrast between the technological sophistication represented by RiverTech's headquarters and the ecological sophistication of Willow Creek Farm. Both represented forms of innovation, but with profoundly different relationships to the natural systems that ultimately sustained all human activity. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine whether these approaches could be integrated into something greater than either could achieve alone, or whether institutional momentum would maintain the separation between technological and ecological innovation that had characterized agricultural development for generations. The stakes extended far beyond a single development project in Cedar Creek Valley. What hung in the balance was the potential emergence of a new approach to agricultural water management, one that leveraged advanced technology in service of watershed health, rather than merely extracting resources more efficiently from increasingly stressed ecosystems. As Mike drifted towards sleep in his minimalist apartment, the challenge ahead was clear. Convincing RiverTech's board to evolve the company's fundamental approach would require more than compelling data or eloquent presentations. It would require bridging worlds that rarely communicated effectively. The corporate technology sector, with its focus on scalable products, and the ecological farming community, with its emphasis on place-based, integrated systems. The chance breakdown that had led him to Willow Creek Farm had created an opportunity for exactly this kind of bridging. Whether institutional structures could accommodate such bridge building remained to be seen, but Mike was increasingly convinced that the future of agricultural resilience depended on precisely this integration of technological sophistication and ecological wisdom. The RiverTech boardroom gleamed with polished walnut and state-of-the-art presentation technology. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Westridge's downtown skyline, the early morning sunlight reflecting off neighboring glass towers. 8 board members sat around the table, their attention divided between tablets displaying quarterly projections and the unexpected visitors whom Mike had ushered in moments earlier. Thomas and Sarah Wilson looked distinctly out of place amid the corporate opulence, their practical clothing and straightforward demeanor contrasting sharply with the board's tailored business attire. Eleanor Nguyen, dressed in a simple but professional pantsuit, carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to civic leadership. Mike had positioned himself between these worlds, both literally and figuratively, as he began his introduction. "Thank you all for accommodating this addition to our agenda," Mike began, standing at the head of the table. "As you know, my assessment visit to Cedar Creek Valley took an unexpected turn when my car broke down near Willow Creek Farm. What began as a simple request for assistance led to a discovery that I believe could fundamentally transform our approach to the Innovation Hub project and potentially RiverTech's entire business model." Several board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Robert Keller, seated directly opposite Mike, maintained a neutral expression that nevertheless communicated his reservations. Thomas Wilson and his daughter Sarah have developed a watershed management system that achieves results our technology has been striving toward, but through a fundamentally different approach. Eleanor Nguyen, as a member of the Millfield Town Council, has been instrumental in extending these principles to community-level implementation. Mike activated the presentation screen, displaying aerial images of Cedar Creek Valley with Willow Creek Farm highlighted. The conventional approach to agricultural water management, including RiverTech's current technology suite, focuses on efficiency, using less water to maintain the same agricultural production. What the Wilsons have developed is fundamentally different. Rather than merely conserving water, their integrated system actually regenerates watershed function. He displayed side-by-side thermal imagery of Willow Creek Farm compared to neighboring properties during drought conditions. The contrast was striking. The Wilson farm maintained cooler temperatures and healthier vegetation patterns, despite using significantly less irrigation water. These aren't just incremental improvements, Mike continued. We're seeing fundamental shifts in water holding capacity, drought resilience, and long-term productivity. Rather than continuing with my planned assessment presentation, I've asked our guests to explain their approach directly. Mike stepped aside, inviting Thomas to take the floor. The farmer moved to the presentation position with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew his subject intimately, if not the corporate setting. Sarah operated the digital display, bringing up detailed schematics of their water management system. Cedar Creek Valley was once one of the most naturally water-rich areas in the region. Thomas began, his voice steady and clear. Natural meandering, waterways, wetlands in low-lying areas, and deep-rooted native vegetation created a landscape that captured, stored, and slowly released water, maintaining productivity even during periodic droughts. He traced the valley's transformation through historical images. The straightening of waterways for flood control, draining of wetlands for additional farmland, removal of native vegetation, and increasingly intensive tillage practices that destroyed soil structure. Each improvement made the valley more vulnerable to drought and flood, Thomas explained. By the time I took over our farm from my father, we were caught in the same cycle as our neighbors, increasingly dependent on irrigation, fertilizers, and other inputs just to maintain production. The presentation shifted to show the systematic changes implemented at Willow Creek Farm over the past 20 years. Water catchment systems that mimicked natural terrain features, strategic placement of vegetation to slow and filter water movement, rebuilding of soil organic matter to increase water holding capacity, and the integration of these elements into a coherent whole that functioned like a healthy watershed in microcosm. As Thomas outlined the technical aspects of their approach, Sarah advanced through detailed data visualizations showing improvements in key metrics over time. Increasing soil organic matter, reduced irrigation requirements, stable productivity during drought years, and decreasing input costs. This isn't a quick fix, Thomas emphasized. It's a systematic redesign that aligns agricultural practices with natural watershed function. The initial implementation requires investment, but the long-term returns include not just reduced costs, but increased resilience to climate volatility. Eleanor Nguyen then addressed the community dimensions, explaining how principles developed at Willow Creek Farm had begun spreading throughout Cedar Creek Valley through a collaborative watershed group. What began as one farm's innovation is evolving into a regional approach to water resilience, she explained. 8 farms have implemented elements of this system, and we're beginning to see watershed-level improvements as these practices reach a critical mass. Throughout the presentation, Mike observed the board members' reactions, initial skepticism giving way to professional interest as the data-driven approach and measurable results became clear. These were business people who respected innovation and recognized potential value, even when it came in unexpected packages. When the presentation concluded, the questions began, pointed, technical inquiries that explored the practicalities, limitations, and scalability of the approach. Sarah fielded the scientific queries with academic precision, while Thomas addressed implementation challenges with practical wisdom drawn from decades of experience. "Your results are impressive," acknowledged Janet Morris, the board's most technically astute member. "But how does this integrate with RiverTech's existing technology suite?" We've invested millions in developing sensors, control systems, and predictive algorithms for water management. It was the opening Mike had been waiting for. He returned to the presentation position, displaying a new conceptual framework he'd developed overnight. "That's exactly the opportunity I see," he explained. "The Wilson approach establishes the fundamental infrastructure and management principles for watershed health. Our technology provides the monitoring, precision control, and data analytics to optimize and scale these principles." He outlined a vision for integration. RiverTech sensors deployed throughout reconstructed watersheds, their control systems managing water flow through natural mimicking infrastructure, their predictive algorithms forecasting needs based on comprehensive ecological data rather than isolated agricultural parameters. Instead of just making conventional agriculture slightly more efficient, we could be enabling transformative approaches to water management that actually regenerate watershed function while maintaining agricultural productivity. "And the business model?" asked Philip Roth, the board's financial strategist. "Our current revenue streams depend on licensing proprietary technology to large agricultural operations. How does this collaborative, ecosystem-based approach translate to sustainable revenue?" It was the crucial question: how to reconcile ecological integration with corporate financial demands. Mike had anticipated it and prepared accordingly. "I envision 3 complementary revenue streams," he explained, displaying financial projections based on market analysis he'd conducted through the night. First, advanced monitoring and management systems specifically designed for integrated watershed approaches, technology that works with rather than against natural processes. Second, implementation services for agricultural operations, transitioning to these methods, leveraging both the Wilson expertise and our technological capabilities. Third, performance-based watershed management contracts with municipalities, irrigation districts, and regional water authorities. He highlighted specific market segments already moving in this direction: drought-stricken agricultural regions desperate for resilience, municipalities facing water security challenges, and progressive agricultural operations recognizing the long-term benefits of regenerative approaches. The Cedar Creek Innovation Hub would serve as both proving ground and showcase, demonstrating the integration of ecological principles and advanced technology. But instead of acquiring land and implementing our predetermined vision, we would establish a collaborative framework with existing landowners and community stakeholders. Robert Keller finally broke his silence. "This represents a significant departure from our established development model. The financial projections Mike presents are theoretical, while our current approach has proven revenue history. The board needs to consider whether this risk is justified by potential returns." The objection was delivered professionally, but clearly established the central tension, not between technology and ecology, but between established business models and emerging possibilities. "Every transformative innovation involves risk," Mike countered. "When we launched smart flow irrigation, analysts questioned whether farmers would adopt algorithm-based watering schedules. Now it's our flagship product because it delivered measurable value. The integrated approach Thomas and Sarah have demonstrated delivers even more significant value, not incremental efficiency improvements, but fundamental resilience." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, examining technical feasibility, market potential, implementation challenges, and competitive positioning. Throughout, Thomas, Sarah, and Eleanor contributed perspectives that grounded the conversation in practical realities rather than abstract corporate planning. As the meeting neared its conclusion, Margaret Chen, the board chair who had remained thoughtfully silent through most of the discussion, addressed the visitors directly. "Mr. Wilson, your family has farmed in Cedar Creek Valley for generations. How do you view RiverTech's interest in the region? Do you see our potential presence as beneficial or threatening to the community? Thomas considered the question carefully. Before responding, his weathered features thoughtful in the morning light streaming through the windows. That depends entirely on how you approach it, he said finally. If RiverTech comes to extract value, buying distressed farms, implementing standardized solutions, and optimizing for corporate returns, the community will lose something precious, even if some individuals benefit financially. But if you come as partners, integrating your technological capabilities with local knowledge and respecting the watershed as a living system rather than a resource to be managed, you could help catalyze a transformation that benefits both the community and your company. Margaret nodded, satisfied with the candid response. And you, Councilwoman Nguyen, what does Millfield need from potential corporate partners? Eleanor straightened slightly, her civic leader persona fully engaged. Millfield needs economic development that strengthens rather than extracts. We've seen companies come through before, promising prosperity while essentially mining our resources: land, water, community knowledge. What Mike is proposing sounds different. A collaborative approach that respects local wisdom while bringing advanced capabilities that small. Communities like ours couldn't access otherwise. As the board meeting concluded, no formal decision was reached. Such a significant strategic shift would require further analysis and consideration. But Margaret announced the formation of a special committee to explore the integrated approach. Mike had proposed, with particular attention, to developing a viable business model that respected both ecological principles and corporate responsibilities to shareholders. Thank you all for this illuminating presentation, she said, addressing Thomas, Sarah, and Eleanor. You've given us much to consider about not just this specific project, but our company's approach to agricultural water management more broadly. As the Wilsons and Eleanor prepared to depart, Mike walked them to the elevator lobby, away from the board members now engaged in post-meeting discussions. You were compelling, he told them. The board is intrigued, even if they're cautious, about changing direction on an established development plan. They asked good questions, Thomas acknowledged. Technical and financial, not just superficial interest. That's more than we've gotten from most corporate visitors to the farm. What happens now? Sarah asked, her practical nature focusing on next steps. The special committee will evaluate the integrated approach and develop recommendations, Mike explained. I'll be leading that process, which gives us an opportunity to design something that genuinely bridges technological innovation and ecological wisdom. And in the meantime, Eleanor pressed, several farms in the valley are struggling financially. If they sell to conventional agricultural corporations while your committee deliberates, the watershed fragmentation will accelerate. It was a valid concern that highlighted the different time frames at work, corporate decision processes measured in quarters and fiscal years versus ecological processes that unfolded across decades. The disconnect between these time frames often resulted in short-term economic decisions that undermined long-term ecological health. What if we established an interim collaboration? Mike suggested, the idea forming as he spoke. Something that doesn't require full board approval, but allows us to begin working together while the broader strategy develops. The concept took shape rapidly in their brief conversation. A pilot project focused on implementing integrated monitoring systems at 3 locations in Cedar Creek Valley, combining RiverTech's sensor technology with the Wilson approach to watershed management. Mike could allocate resources from his existing research and development budget without requiring special board approval, while the Wilsons could expand their collaborative network to include technological dimensions previously beyond their reach. It wouldn't address land acquisition concerns immediately, Mike acknowledged, but it would establish working relationships and generate data to support the broader collaboration. To date, They parted with cautious optimism, the Wilsons and Eleanor returning to Cedar Creek Valley, while Mike rejoined the board members for continued discussions. The day stretched into evening as financial models were recalculated, market analyses reviewed, and technical feasibilities assessed. When Mike finally left RiverTech headquarters, the city lights were reflecting off rain-slicked streets, creating shimmering patterns that reminded him of the water flow visualizations Thomas had shown during his presentation. The urban ecosystem functioned on principles similar to agricultural watersheds. Water, energy, and resources flowing through systems that could either support or degrade long-term resilience. His phone chimed with a message from Sarah. Safe journey back to the valley. Dad's connecting with neighboring farms about potential monitoring sites. The simple update reinforced the fundamental difference in approach between Thomas Wilson and typical corporate partners. While RiverTech's board deliberated carefully measured steps within established business frameworks, Thomas was already moving forward based on relationships and ecological understanding, confident that proper preparation would create opportunities regardless of corporate decisions. Mike found himself drawn to this orientation toward action, grounded in both ecological principles and community relationships. Throughout his career, he had operated within corporate structures that prioritize careful analysis, risk management, and strategic positioning. These approaches had built RiverTech into a successful company, but they sometimes created paralysis when faced with opportunities that didn't fit established patterns. As he drove toward his apartment, Mike made an impulsive decision, turning his car toward the highway instead. The 3-hour drive to Cedar Creek Valley in the dark wasn't part of any strategic plan, but something in him resisted returning to his minimalist urban apartment. The contrast between the boardroom's carefully managed deliberations and Thomas's practical implementation felt too stark. The gap between corporate and ecological timeframes too significant to be bridged from behind a desk. The highway stretched. Before him, city lights gradually giving way to darkness as he moved into rural landscapes. Rain fell steadily, droplets catching the headlights in momentary suspension before returning to the greater hydrological cycle. Water moving through systems, each droplet following the path of least resistance, yet collectively creating patterns that shaped landscapes over time. Not unlike how individual decisions accumulated to create institutions, economies, and social structures. It was nearly midnight when Mike reached Millfield, the small town silent, except for a single streetlight illuminating the rain-washed intersection at its center. He checked into the Millfield Inn, the lodging Thomas had originally suggested when his car broke down, and fell into exhausted sleep, the day's presentations and deliberations finally giving way to dreamless rest. Morning arrived with clearing, skies, and renewed clarity. Over breakfast at the town's sole diner, Mike mapped out a practical approach to the pilot project he'd proposed the previous day. 3 monitoring sites strategically positioned throughout the watershed. Integration of RiverTech's advanced sensors with the Wilsons' ecological framework. Data collection protocols that captured both technological and ecological parameters. A governance structure that respected both corporate and community interests. By the time he arrived at Willow Creek Farm, the outline had evolved into a comprehensive implementation plan. He found Thomas in the monitoring shed, already at work, integrating new soil sensors into their system. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," Thomas remarked, looking up from his work. "Board deliberations usually take longer than overnight." "They do," Mike acknowledged. "The special committee will spend weeks analyzing the integrated approach before making formal recommendations, but I realized we don't need to wait for that process to begin practical collaboration." He outlined the pilot project plan he'd developed, emphasizing how it could demonstrate the value of integration without requiring full corporate commitment immediately. Thomas listened attentively, asking pointed questions about technical specifications, data ownership, and decision-making processes. This could work, he concluded after reviewing the proposal. It gives us access to monitoring capabilities we couldn't afford independently, while giving you practical implementation experience with our watershed approach. Sarah arrived as they were discussing potential monitoring locations, her expression showing surprise at finding Mike back in their monitoring shed. "I thought corporate deliberations would keep you in Westridge for weeks," she commented, setting down soil samples she'd been collecting. "They will," Mike replied, "but I realized this collaboration needs to operate at multiple timescales simultaneously. The board will follow their necessary processes, but we can begin practical implementation in parallel." The simple statement encapsulated the emerging approach, respecting corporate governance requirements while not allowing them to prevent timely action on ecological opportunities. It represented a bridging of worlds that typically operated in isolation, each with valid priorities, but incomplete perspectives. Over the next several hours, they refined the pilot project design, identifying 3 strategic monitoring locations that would capture diverse conditions throughout the watershed. Thomas suggested including Rebecca Martinez's farm, one of the few remaining family operations surrounded by corporate agricultural holdings, as a demonstration of how integrated approaches could revitalize struggling properties. Eleanor Nguyen joined them for lunch, bringing maps of municipal water systems that could potentially connect with the watershed monitoring network. Her practical civic perspective highlighted community dimensions that neither corporate planning nor ecological science fully addressed. How water management affected municipal budgets, infrastructure planning, and community economic development. If we're monitoring watershed health and agricultural water use, we should include municipal dimensions as well, she suggested, indicating locations where town infrastructure interfaced with agricultural systems. Water doesn't recognize property boundaries or jurisdictional divisions. Our monitoring approach shouldn't either. The collaborative planning session continued into afternoon, the project expanding beyond simple technology implementation to encompass a truly integrated approach to watershed monitoring and management. What had begun as a technical pilot was evolving into a potential governance model for the larger collaboration. Practical, inclusive, and focused on generating actionable knowledge rather than merely collecting data. As evening approached, Mike realized he had spent the entire day immersed in planning details rather than returning to Westridge as his schedule dictated. Several messages from Robert indicated growing impatience with his extended absence, while the special committee had scheduled their first formal meeting for the following morning. "I need to get back," he acknowledged reluctantly. "The corporate machinery continues whether I'm physically present or not." "We'll continue developing the implementation plan here," Thomas assured him. "By the time your committee reaches preliminary conclusions, we'll have practical demonstrations ready to support their theoretical analyses." The parallel processes represented exactly the integration Mike now envisioned. Corporate deliberation, providing institutional support, while community implementation generated practical knowledge. Neither alone was sufficient, but together they might create something greater than either could accomplish independently. As Mike prepared to depart, Sarah handed him a flash drive. "I've compiled additional data on our watershed approach. 15 years of soil health measurements, water retention capacity improvements, and yield stability during drought conditions. Technical documentation that might help your committee understand the scientific foundations of what can look deceptively simple." The gesture reinforced what Mike was increasingly recognizing. The Wilson approach wasn't merely practical farming techniques, but a sophisticated ecological methodology built on careful observation, systematic data collection, and rigorous analysis. It was science practiced outside institutional structures, knowledge developed through direct engagement with living systems rather than laboratory isolation. Driving back toward Westridge in the fading light, Mike reflected on the contrasting worldviews he was attempting to bridge. Corporate approaches valued scalability, standardization, and predictable returns, creating technologies that could be widely deployed across diverse contexts. Ecological approaches emphasize specificity, relationship, and regenerative capacity, developing methodologies that worked with particular landscapes and communities. Each had strengths the other lacked. Corporate approaches could mobilize resources and implement solutions at scales beyond what local communities could achieve independently. Ecological approaches understood the fundamental interconnections that determined long-term resilience in ways corporate efficiency models often missed. The challenge wasn't choosing between these approaches, but integrating them, developing technologies that supported ecological health while creating governance, structures that respected both corporate and community priorities. The Cedar Creek Valley project had unexpectedly become a laboratory for exactly this kind of integration. Back in Westridge the following morning, Mike found himself navigating institutional politics as the special committee began its formal assessment process. Robert remained skeptical about deviating from their established development model, while other committee members expressed varying degrees of interest in the integrated approach. The board was impressed by the Wilson presentation, Janet Morris acknowledged during a private conversation before the meeting. The data on drought resilience and reduced input costs is compelling, but translating their farm-scale approach into a corporate business model remains challenging. That's precisely what we need to develop, Mike replied, not extracting techniques from their approach, but creating a new model that integrates technological and ecological innovation. The committee meeting proceeded with careful analysis of market potential, technical requirements, and financial projections. Corporate processes unfolding at corporate pace, methodically building the institutional case for innovation while maintaining fiduciary responsibility. Meanwhile, Mike's phone occasionally lit up with updates from Cedar Creek Valley, Thomas, securing permission from Rebecca Martinez to establish a monitoring station on her struggling farm. Eleanor identifying municipal infrastructure that could connect with the watershed network. Sarah developing data integration protocols to merge RiverTech sensor outputs with their ecological monitoring. The parallel activities represented exactly the integration Mike now championed. Corporate deliberation and community implementation advancing simultaneously rather than sequentially, each informing the other through continuous feedback rather than periodic formal reports. By week's end, a tentative framework had emerged from the committee deliberations, a phased approach to the Cedar Creek Innovation Hub that would begin with the monitoring network pilot project while developing broader collaborative structures for potential expansion. Not the wholesale transformation Mike had initially envisioned, but a meaningful step toward integration that maintained both corporate and community priorities. As he drove back to Cedar Creek Valley that Friday evening, carrying official authorization for the pilot project and initial equipment allocations, Mike reflected on how much had changed since his car had broken down on that dusty road less than 2 weeks earlier. What had begun as a standard corporate site assessment had evolved into an experiment in bridging technological innovation and ecological wisdom. An experiment that might ultimately transform not just Cedar Creek Valley, but RiverTech's entire approach to agricultural water management. The sun was setting as he passed the spot where his car had overheated, golden light illuminating the valley in warm hues that highlighted the patchwork of agricultural approaches visible across the landscape. In that moment, Mike understood. that the real innovation wasn't technological or ecological in isolation, but the integration of these approaches into something that respected both corporate capabilities and community wisdom. The breakdown that had initially seemed like an unfortunate disruption had instead created an opening for precisely this kind of integration, a chance meeting between different worlds that might ultimately benefit both. 5 years to the day, after Mike Rivera's car broke down outside Willow Creek Farm, a celebration gathered beneath oak trees on the hillside overlooking Cedar Creek Valley. Farmers, technologists, community members, and corporate executives mingled easily, sharing food grown on the very land their collaborative efforts had transformed. At the center of it all stood a modest granite marker commemorating what locals now called the fortuitous breakdown, the chance encounter that had sparked a revolution in agricultural water management. I still can't believe it all started with a blown head gasket, Eleanor Nguyen remarked, now serving her second term as mayor of a revitalized Millfield. The town had flourished as the Watershed Innovation Center brought jobs, researchers, and visitors to the once struggling community. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with unexpected detours, Thomas replied, his weathered face creased in a smile as he surveyed the gathering. Though officially retired, he remained the spiritual center of the Watershed Initiative, his decades of practical wisdom guiding new generations of farmers, transitioning to integrated management approaches. Zara moved through the crowd, introducing visiting researchers to local farmers, implementing variations of the watershed approach. Her work had expanded far beyond Cedar Creek Valley, with collaborative research projects now spanning 3 continents. The peer-reviewed papers documenting their integrated methodology had transformed academic understanding of agricultural water systems, bringing ecological approaches into mainstream scientific discourse. Mike stood slightly apart, watching the interactions with quiet satisfaction. RiverTech had evolved beyond recognition from the company he had led 5 years earlier, where once they had developed technologies that merely made conventional agriculture more efficient, they now created integrated systems that actively regenerated watershed function. Their market value had tripled as water scarcity increasingly dominated global agricultural concerns, but the true measure of success lay visible across the transformed landscape before him. Rebecca Martinez approached, accompanied by her daughter, who had recently returned to the family farm after completing agricultural studies at the State University. "We're expanding the restoration zone along the creek next month," she informed Mike. "The new monitoring systems your team developed are helping us track soil moisture patterns we never could have detected before." The seamless way she integrated technical and ecological language embodied exactly what had emerged throughout Cedar Creek Valley, not 2 separate approaches working in parallel, but a genuinely integrated methodology that respected both technological sophistication and natural wisdom. As evening approached, the gathering naturally gravitated toward a clearing where chairs had been arranged for a brief ceremony. Robert Keller, who had initially been the most skeptical about deviating from RiverTech's established business model, now stood to address the community. His transformation had perhaps been the most surprising, from corporate traditionalist to advocate for integrated approaches that balanced ecological health with business success. 5 years ago, when Mike first proposed this collaboration, I saw it primarily as a risk to our established technology platform, he acknowledged candidly. Today, I see it as the model that saved not just our company, but potentially agricultural water management worldwide. The formal recognition that followed celebrated specific achievements, restored creek sections, regenerated soil systems, innovative monitoring technologies. But the true accomplishment transcended measurable metrics. Cedar Creek Valley, had become a proving ground for reconciliation between technological innovation and ecological wisdom. Corporate efficiency and community resilience, human systems and natural processes. As twilight deepened and lanterns illuminated the gathering, Mike found himself standing beside Thomas at almost the exact spot where they had first discussed watershed function years earlier. The valley spread before them, a living demonstration of what became possible when different knowledge systems worked in harmony rather than opposition. "Did you ever imagine it would spread this far?" Mike asked, gesturing toward the valley where integrated water management had now become the dominant approach, with similar initiatives emerging in watersheds across the region. "The principles were always sound," Thomas replied. "What was missing was the bridge between technological capability and ecological understanding. Sometimes it takes a breakdown to create an opening for something new to emerge." The simple observation captured the essence of their journey. How disruption had created opportunity. How unexpected connection had sparked innovation. How genuine integration had emerged from worlds that typically remained separate. The path hadn't been without challenges, setbacks, and tensions between different priorities and perspectives, but through continued dialogue and practical collaboration, they had created something neither could have developed alone. As the celebration continued into evening, stories were shared of other breakdowns that had occurred throughout the region, moments when conventional approaches faltered, creating openings for integrated alternatives to emerge. Each represented another thread in the expanding fabric of transformation, another demonstration that technological sophistication and ecological wisdom could work in harmony rather than opposition. The granite marker commemorating Mike's original car breakdown stood as modest testament to how seemingly random events sometimes create precisely the connections needed for new possibilities to emerge. The car that had stranded him on that dusty road had long since been replaced, but the relationship catalyzed by that momentary disruption had changed not just individual lives, but an entire watershed's trajectory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, further innovations, continued dialogue between different perspectives. The work of integration was never complete, requiring constant attention to both technological advancement and ecological relationship. But Cedar Creek Valley now embodied a living example of what became possible when human ingenuity aligned with natural wisdom rather than working against it, when breakdowns became breakthroughs. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen, if this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.